Radio City Music Hall, March 1994. The most iconic music venue in New York City was sold out, packed with 6,000 people who had paid premium prices to see Whitney Houston at the absolute peak of her powers. The Bodyguard soundtrack had spent 20 weeks at #1. I Will Always Love You had become the best-selling single by a female artist in history. Whitney was untouchable, unstoppable, the biggest star on the planet. But as she stood backstage, adjusting her gown and warming up her voice, none of that mattered. Because sitting in the fifth row, center section, was the only person whose opinion had ever truly mattered. Her mother, Cissy Houston. And Cissy had never fully approved of the path her daughter had chosen. What happened that night between mother and daughter would haunt Whitney for the rest of her life, revealing the painful truth that sometimes the people we love most are the ones we can never quite satisfy. If you lived through the 90s, you remember when Whitney Houston was everywhere. Her voice was on every radio station, her face on every magazine cover, her videos in constant rotation on MTV. But what most people didn't know was that behind all that success was a woman desperately trying to win approval from the one person who seemed impossible to impress. To understand what happened at Radio City Music Hall that March night, you need to understand the complicated relationship between Whitney Houston and her mother, Emily Cissy Houston. This wasn't just any mother-daughter relationship. This was a bond forged in the sacred fire of gospel music, tested by the secular temptations of pop stardom, and strained by expectations that no human being could ever fully meet. Cissy Houston was gospel royalty long before Whitney was born. She had sung backup for Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley, and countless other legends. She led the gospel group, the Sweet Inspirations, and was considered one of the finest gospel singers of her generation. When Cissy sang, you didn't just hear music. You heard the voice of God, channeled through a woman who had dedicated her entire life to sacred music. Church wasn't just where Cissy went on Sundays. It was who she was, what she believed in, and how she measured the worth of music itself. In Cissy's world, music had one purpose: to glorify God. Everything else was compromise, distraction, or worse, selling your soul for worldly success. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born into this world on August 9th, 1963, and from her very first breath, her destiny seemed predetermined. She would sing for the Lord. She would carry on the Houston family's gospel tradition. She would use her gift, and everyone knew from the moment Whitney first opened her mouth that she had a gift unlike anything they had ever heard, to bring people closer to God. Cissy began training Whitney almost as soon as the little girl could talk. Not in the casual way some parents encourage their children's interests, but with the intensity of someone preparing a soldier for battle. Whitney's childhood was structured around the church. She sang in the New Hope Baptist Church Junior Gospel Choir in Newark, New Jersey. She practiced scales and breathing techniques under her mother's strict supervision. She learned to sing with power, with control, with that particular blend of technical perfection and emotional authenticity that defined the Houston sound. But even as a child, Whitney felt the weight of her mother's expectations pressing down on her like a physical force. Cissy wasn't just teaching her daughter to sing. She was molding her into something specific, something that would reflect well on the Houston name and honor the gospel tradition that Cissy held sacred. There was no room for mistakes, no tolerance for anything less than excellence, and absolutely no consideration of what Whitney herself might want. My mother was tough, Whitney would later say in interviews, though she always said it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She expected perfection. She expected dedication. And she expected me to understand that my gift came from God and belonged to God. The first cracks in Cissy's vision for her daughter appeared when Whitney was still a teenager. Jerry Griffith, a talent scout, saw 14-year-old Whitney singing backup for her mother at a nightclub and immediately recognized something extraordinary. This wasn't just another talented kid. This was a voice that could sell millions of records, a presence that could dominate pop music for decades. But when Griffith approached Cissy about Whitney pursuing a pop career, he encountered a wall of resistance that would define Whitney's entire life. Cissy didn't want her daughter singing secular music. She didn't want Whitney pursuing fame and fortune in an industry Cissy considered morally bankrupt. Most of all, she didn't want to lose her daughter to the same world that had corrupted so many other talented young people. The tension between mother and daughter intensified throughout Whitney's teenage years. Whitney loved gospel music. She truly did. When she sang in church, she felt connected to something larger than herself. But she also felt something else pulling at her, a desire to reach beyond the church walls, to touch people who would never walk through the doors of New Hope Baptist Church, to prove that she could be more than just Cissy Houston's daughter, carrying on the family tradition. When Clive Davis, the legendary music executive who had discovered and shaped the careers of countless superstars, first heard Whitney's demo tape in 1983, he knew immediately that he had found something special. This was the voice he had been searching for, a voice that could bridge the gap between R&B and pop, between black audiences and white audiences, between gospel authenticity and mainstream commercial appeal. But signing Whitney Houston wasn't just a matter of negotiating a record contract. It was navigating the complicated relationship between an ambitious young woman who wanted to conquer the world and a mother who believed that ambition itself was a form of sin. Cissy agreed to let Whitney sign with Arista Records, but she made her disapproval clear. This was not the path she had wanted for her daughter. This was not the destiny she had spent years preparing Whitney to fulfill. And no matter how successful Whitney became, Cissy would always view that success through the lens of what had been sacrificed to achieve it. The soul of the music, the sacred purpose, the connection to God that Cissy believed could only be maintained through gospel music. Whitney's debut album in 1985 was an instant commercial success, selling millions of copies and producing 3 number-one singles. Critics praised her voice, her range, her ability to make even the most commercial pop songs sound authentic and emotionally resonant. But when Cissy listened to that album, she heard something different. She heard her daughter's incredible God-given gift being used to sing about romantic love, about dancing, about things that had nothing to do with glorifying the Lord. She heard compromise. She heard her daughter choosing fame over faith, commercial success over spiritual purpose. And though Cissy never said it directly, Whitney felt her mother's disappointment in every conversation, every phone call, every family gathering where Cissy would talk enthusiastically about other gospel singers but would only mention Whitney's career in passing. The second album in 1987 was even more successful, solidifying Whitney's position as the biggest female pop star in the world. But success didn't ease the tension with her mother. If anything, it made things worse. The bigger Whitney's fame grew, the further she seemed to drift from the gospel roots that Cissy considered sacred. Whitney tried to bridge the gap. She recorded gospel songs. She performed at church events. She spoke in interviews about her faith and her gospel background. But nothing seemed to satisfy Cissy, who had a very specific vision of what her daughter should be. And that vision didn't include sold-out stadium tours, pop music videos on MTV, or romantic ballads that made teenage girls cry. By the time 1992 rolled around and The Bodyguard became a cultural phenomenon, Whitney had achieved a level of success that most artists only dream about. I Will Always Love You wasn't just a hit song. It was a cultural moment, a performance so powerful that it transcended music and became something people would remember for the rest of their lives. You couldn't escape that song in 1992 and 1993. It was playing in every store, every restaurant, every radio, and every car. Whitney Houston had conquered the world, but she still hadn't conquered the distance between herself and her mother. The idea for the Radio City Music Hall concert came from Whitney herself. It was March 1994, and she wanted to do something different, something more intimate than the massive arena shows she had been performing. Radio City was iconic, historic, a venue that had hosted everyone from Frank Sinatra to Ella Fitzgerald. It was the kind of place that Cissy respected, that carried weight and prestige beyond just commercial success. Whitney decided that this concert would be her gift to her mother. She would structure the entire evening around the music Cissy loved, incorporating gospel standards alongside her pop hits, demonstrating that she hadn't forgotten where she came from or abandoned the traditions her mother had taught her. She personally invited Cissy to sit in the 5th row, close enough to see every expression on Whitney's face, close enough to hear every note with crystal clarity. In the weeks leading up to the Radio City concert, Whitney was more anxious than anyone had seen her in years. Her backup singers noticed that she was more particular about rehearsals, more demanding about arrangements, more emotional during run-throughs. She kept asking us if it sounded authentic, remembered Ricky Minor, her musical director at the time. She wanted to make sure the gospel songs especially sounded right, sounded real, like they came from a heart and not just from technical skill. Whitney personally selected which songs to include, creating a set list that told the story of her musical journey from the church to the pop charts and back again. She wanted her mother to see that she could do both, that she hadn't chosen one over the other, that she was still Cissy Houston's daughter, even while being Whitney Houston, the global superstar. The night of the concert arrived, March 17, 1994. Radio City Music Hall glittered with the kind of old-world glamour that made every event feel significant. 6,000 people filled the iconic venue, but Whitney's focus was on those two seats in the fifth row where Cissy Houston sat with Whitney's father, John. As Whitney prepared backstage, going through her usual pre-show rituals, she kept returning to the same thought. Tonight will be different. Tonight her mother would finally see that Whitney had made the right choice, that she could honor her gospel roots while reaching millions of people who would never set foot in a church. Tonight Cissy would be proud. The concert began with Whitney emerging in a stunning white gown that seemed to glow under the stage lights. She opened with a medley of her pop hits, reminding the audience why they had paid to see her, giving them the commercial Whitney Houston they expected. The crowd was electric, screaming with every note, singing along to every word. But Whitney's eyes kept drifting to that fifth row, to her mother's face, trying to read Cissy's reaction. Then came the transition Whitney had planned so carefully. After performing several pop songs, she paused and spoke directly to the audience. "Tonight is special for me," she said, her voice carrying that intimate quality that made every person in the venue feel like she was speaking directly to them. "Because my mother is here, Cissy Houston, and everything I know about singing, everything I know about music, I learned from her." The spotlight found Cissy in the fifth row, and the audience erupted in applause. Cissy smiled and nodded, acknowledging the recognition, but her expression remained composed, giving nothing away. Whitney continued, "My mother taught me that music isn't just about hitting notes. It's about touching souls. So tonight I want to take you all to where I started, to the church, to the gospel music that shaped who I am." What followed was a performance unlike anything Whitney had done in her pop career. She stripped away all the production, all the commercial polish, and delivered a raw, powerful gospel set that showcased not just her technical ability, but her spiritual connection to the music. She sang, "I Love the Lord," one of Cissy's favorite gospel standards, with such intensity that people in the audience began crying. She performed "I Go to the Rock," another church classic, with the kind of authentic emotion that could only come from someone who truly understood the sacred nature of the music. But as Whitney sang, pouring her heart and soul into every note, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She looked at her mother and saw not pride or approval, but something else entirely. Cissy's face showed appreciation for the technical skill, acknowledgement of Whitney's vocal prowess, but there was a distance in her eyes that Whitney recognized all too well. It was the same distance that had been there at every other performance, every other achievement, every other milestone in Whitney's career. The distance that said, "This is good, but it's not what it should be. You're performing gospel music in a secular venue, for a secular audience, as part of a show that also includes pop songs. This isn't pure. This isn't what I raised you to do." Whitney felt something break inside her chest as she sang. Here she was at the peak of her fame, performing in one of the world's most prestigious venues, singing the music her mother loved with all the skill and authenticity she possessed, and it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Because in Cissy's eyes, Whitney had made a choice years ago when she signed with Clive Davis, when she agreed to sing pop music, when she chose fame over faith. And no matter how many gospel songs Whitney performed, no matter how technically perfect her execution, nothing could undo that original choice. The concert continued, with Whitney moving between pop hits and gospel standards, trying desperately to demonstrate that she could be both, that she hadn't abandoned one for the other. She performed "I Will Always Love You," and the audience lost their minds, screaming and crying as her voice soared to those impossible high notes. She looked at her mother, hoping to see some recognition of what she had achieved, some acknowledgement that this level of artistry meant something. But Cissy's expression remained neutral, polite, showing the same kind of appreciation she might show for any talented performer, but not the pride a mother should show for her daughter's greatest achievement. During Greatest Love of All, a song about self-acceptance and finding strength within yourself, Whitney's voice began to crack with emotion. Not because she was struggling technically, but because the irony of the lyrics was almost too much to bear. She was singing about believing in yourself and finding validation from within, while desperately seeking her mother's approval, while breaking apart inside, because that approval seemed forever out of reach. The audience interpreted her emotion as artistic passion, as a singer connecting deeply with the material. They didn't know they were witnessing a woman's heart breaking in real time. The concert reached its climax with a powerful rendition of His Eye is on the Sparrow, the gospel song that had been a cornerstone of Whitney's childhood. This was the song Cissy had taught her, the song they had sung together countless times in church, the song that represented everything Cissy valued about music and faith. Whitney poured everything she had into that performance, using every technique Cissy had taught her, channeling every lesson learned in those early morning practice sessions, in the church choir, in the countless hours of training that had shaped her voice. If anything was going to reach her mother, if anything was going to break through that wall of disappointment and disapproval, it would be this song, performed with all the authenticity and spiritual connection Whitney could summon. As the final notes faded and the audience erupted in a standing ovation, Whitney looked directly at her mother. Cissy was standing too, applauding along with everyone else. But her eyes told the truth. She was proud of the technique, appreciative of the skill, but she wasn't moved in the way a mother should be moved by her daughter's greatest performance. Because to Cissy, this entire concert was evidence of the problem, not the solution. Whitney was using her God-given gift in a commercial context, performing sacred music alongside secular songs, treating gospel standards as just another element in a pop concert rather than as the sacred expressions of faith they were meant to be. After the concert, backstage at Radio City Music Hall, mother and daughter had a conversation that would define their relationship for the rest of Whitney's life. Cissy came to Whitney's dressing room, and for a moment, Whitney hoped that maybe tonight had changed something. Maybe her mother had finally seen what Whitney had been trying to show her all these years. "You sang beautifully tonight," Cissy said, and Whitney's heart lifted for a moment before Cissy continued. "Your technique was flawless. Your voice was as strong as I've ever heard it." But then came the words that shattered Whitney's hope. "But baby, you're wasting your gift on all this pop music. You could be doing so much more for the Lord." Whitney tried to explain that she was reaching millions of people, that her music touched lives, that she was using her gift to bring joy and hope to people all over the world. But Cissy shook her head. "That's not the same as serving God. That's serving your own ego, serving fame, serving money. I raised you better than this." The words hung in the air between them, creating a chasm that would never fully close. Whitney realized in that moment something she had probably known deep down for years. She would never be able to satisfy her mother's expectations because those expectations were fundamentally at odds with who Whitney had chosen to become. Cissy wanted a daughter who sang only gospel music, who performed only in churches, who used her gift exclusively for sacred purposes. But Whitney was a woman who wanted to reach the whole world, who found meaning and purpose in touching people's lives regardless of whether they were religious, who believed that love and joy and hope were sacred even when expressed through pop music. The years following the Radio City concert saw Whitney's relationship with her mother grow more strained. As Whitney's personal struggles intensified, as her marriage to Bobby Brown became increasingly troubled, as her battles with substance abuse became public knowledge, Cissy's disappointment transformed into something harder, colder. "I told you that world would destroy you," Cissy said during one particularly painful conversation. "I warned you what would happen if you chose fame over faith." Whitney tried to explain that her problems weren't caused by singing pop music, that addiction and pain could happen to anyone regardless of what kind of music they performed. But in Cissy's mind, there was a direct line connecting Whitney's choice to pursue secular success with the troubles that followed. The tragic irony was that Whitney never stopped trying to win her mother's approval. Even during her darkest periods, even when her voice was damaged from substance abuse and her career was in decline, Whitney would still talk about wanting to make her mother proud. She recorded a gospel album in her later years, "I Look to You," hoping that returning to gospel music would finally bridge the gap with Cissy. But by then, the damage was too deep, the disappointment too ingrained. Cissy appreciated the album, acknowledged the return to gospel roots, but the underlying message remained the same. Too little too late. When Whitney Houston died on February 11th, 2012, found unconscious in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, the world mourned the loss of one of the greatest voices in music history. But for Cissy Houston, the grief was complicated by something darker. Her daughter had died without ever fully reconciling their relationship, without ever resolving the fundamental tension that had defined their bond. Whitney had spent her entire life trying to prove that she could honor her mother's values while also being her own person, and she had never succeeded in making Cissy believe it was possible. At Whitney's funeral, Cissy sang, I Never Lost My Praise, a gospel song that spoke about maintaining faith through trials and tribulations. Her voice, still powerful despite her age, filled the New Hope Baptist Church where Whitney had first learned to sing as a child. But many people watching noticed something heartbreaking. Cissy sang with perfect technique, with undeniable skill, but there was a coldness to the performance that felt wrong for a mother burying her daughter. It was as if even in death, Cissy couldn't fully let go of her disappointment, couldn't separate her love for Whitney from her disapproval of the choices Whitney had made. Years after Whitney's death, Cissy Houston published a memoir that revealed just how complicated her feelings about her daughter had been. She wrote about being proud of Whitney's success, but disappointed in her choices. She wrote about loving her daughter, but hating the person fame had turned her into. She wrote about watching Whitney's talent being wasted on pop music when it could have been used for higher purposes. The book shocked many people who had expected a grieving mother to paint her deceased daughter in the most positive light possible. Instead, Cissy's memoir read like a final judgment, a last word on a relationship that had never found resolution. The tragic truth that emerged from Whitney Houston's life was that she had spent her entire existence trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. She wanted to be both the daughter Cissy expected and the artist Whitney needed to be. She wanted to honor her gospel roots while conquering the pop world. She wanted her mother's approval while living her own life on her own terms. And the stress of trying to be both things simultaneously, of never feeling good enough for the one person whose approval mattered most, contributed to the pain and struggles that eventually destroyed her. The Radio City Music Hall concert in March 1994 represented the pinnacle of Whitney's attempt to reconcile these competing demands. She had structured the entire evening around demonstrating to her mother that she hadn't abandoned her roots, that she could be a pop superstar and still honor the gospel traditions Cissy held sacred. But the concert's failure to change her mother's mind was a turning point. After that night, something shifted in Whitney. She stopped trying quite so hard to win Cissy's approval. She made choices more for herself and less to satisfy her mother's expectations. And perhaps not coincidentally, that was also when her personal struggles began to intensify, as if the abandonment of that impossible goal left a void that nothing else could fill. The story of Whitney Houston and Cissy Houston is ultimately a story about the devastating impact of conditional love. Cissy loved her daughter, but that love was always contingent on Whitney being a certain kind of person, making certain kinds of choices, using her gift in ways that aligned with Cissy's values and vision. When Whitney chose a different path, she didn't lose her mother's love entirely, but she lost something almost as important: her mother's pride, her mother's unqualified support, her mother's belief that Whitney was doing the right thing. And for someone as sensitive and emotionally vulnerable as Whitney, that loss was catastrophic. In interviews years after Whitney's death, people who knew them both spoke about the tragedy of their relationship. Whitney would have given anything to hear her mother say she was proud of her without any qualifiers, said one close friend. She would have given up fame, fortune, all of it, just to have Cissy look at her with pure love and approval. But Cissy couldn't do that. She couldn't separate Whitney's choices from Whitney's worth. And that killed Whitney long before the actual death came. Music producer David Foster, who worked with Whitney on several projects, remembered her talking about her mother during recording sessions. She would say things like, "I hope my mother likes this one," or "maybe this will make my mother understand." It was heartbreaking to watch this global superstar, this woman who had everything, still desperately seeking her mother's approval like a little girl. The legacy of that Radio City Music Hall concert is complicated. Musically, it was a triumph, one of Whitney's finest performances, showcasing both her technical skill and her emotional depth. The recording of that concert has become a cherished artifact for fans, evidence of Whitney at her peak, able to move seamlessly between pop and gospel, between commercial entertainment and sacred expression. But for those who understood what was really happening that night, the concert represents something sadder. It was a moment when Whitney finally realized that no performance would ever be good enough, no achievement significant enough, no demonstration of skill sufficient to win the unconditional approval she desperately craved from her mother. In the end, Whitney Houston died at 48 years old, a woman who had touched millions of lives with her voice, but had never managed to touch the one person she most wanted to reach. She had sold over 200 million records worldwide, had won countless awards, had achieved a level of success that most artists couldn't even imagine. But she had never heard her mother say, without qualification or reservation, I'm proud of who you are and the choices you've made. And that absence, that hole in her heart where her mother's approval should have been, was something no amount of fame or success could ever fill. The tragic lesson of Whitney Houston's life is that sometimes the people we love most are the people who hurt us most deeply. Not because they intend to harm us, but because they love us with conditions, with expectations, with a vision of who we should be that doesn't allow for who we actually are. Cissy Houston loved her daughter, but she loved an idealized version of Whitney more than she loved the real woman standing in front of her. And Whitney Houston spent her entire life trying to become that idealized version, sacrificing parts of herself, struggling against her own nature, trying desperately to fit into a mold that was never designed for who she truly was. If you're moved by this tragic story of a daughter's impossible quest for her mother's approval, share it with someone who understands the pain of never feeling good enough for the people who should love us unconditionally. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we have more stories that reveal the heartbreaking truth behind the glittering facades of fame. And if you've ever felt like you were performing your entire life for an audience of one person who refused to applaud, leave a comment below. You're not alone. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't failing to achieve your dreams. It's achieving everything the world says you should want and still feeling empty because the one person whose opinion mattered never truly saw you. Retry.